Hi everyone! Today I'm going to be talking all about cast-ons, knitted cast-ons. There's a bunch of different kinds. We're going to say what are they, why would we use them, and what are my favorite tips and tricks. There are a bazillion different ways to cast on a project in knitting, and I think it can be very confusing, especially when you're just getting started, to kind of think, can I just use the one I know? Why do even so many exist? What's going on here? So that is what I wanted to chat about today, is all about the different ways to cast on. I am going to talk mostly about the three ones that I consider to be the most common, and I'm going to kind of do a little example of how those different ones work, and the pros and cons of each of them. There are probably 100 different ways, different styles of casting on, so I'm certainly not going to go through all of them, but I hope to kind of hit the main categories of the ones other than the top three, and kind of give you the skills to think through them about which one you might like, or which kind of how to think about, do I need to follow this instruction, can I substitute a different one, kind of a thing. So let's jump right in. I am going to start by talking about the one that I teach beginning knitters. I've taught a lot of beginning knitting classes in my time. I always teach this cast on to beginners, and in our Learn to Knit kit, Cast On to Cables, this is the cast on style that I teach, and it is called a knitted cast on. Now, the reason that I teach it to beginners is because it is almost identical to the knit stitch. So once you learn how to do this cast on, you basically know how to do a knit stitch already. And then when you finish your little practice piece when you're getting started, then you remember how to do the cast on because you've just been doing the knit stitch. So I think this is a fantastic one for beginners. If I'm being honest, this is not the one that I use the most because I find it a little bit slower to cast on stitches this way. But it has a lot of the other benefits of my personal preference for casting on. So to start off with the knitted cast on, you are going to tie a slip knot. That's how pretty much every cast on I can think of starts, by tying a slip knot. If you pull the tail and your loop changes size, you tied a slip knot. Put the slip knot on one of your needles and pull it snug. Anytime you're getting started with this, and basically anytime you're doing anything with knitting, you never want to like white knuckle pull as hard as you possibly can. Like just sort of so it touches the needle all the way around. And then for the knitted cast on, we are going to put that needle with the loop on it. That is going to go into our left hand. We're going to pick up our empty needle in our right hand. The fact that these are straight needles doesn't matter. They could be circular needles, whatever. It's all the only part of your needles that you use are the pointy ends. So to do the knitted cast on, the first three steps are identical to the knit stitch. Step 1, our needle goes in, just like for a knit stitch. Step 2, our yarn goes around, just like a normal knit stitch. Step 3, we pull that loop through, just like a normal knit stitch. So at this point you have a loop on each needle, and you are just going to take that brand new loop that you just made on your right hand needle, and you're going to stick that over onto your left hand needle. Now your right hand needle is empty again. We're going to rinse and repeat. That is all there is to it. So now we have 2 loops on this one, and again, you can tighten it up just a little bit if you want to, but I would leave it pretty loose. And to do the knitted cast on, you are just going to do that exact same thing until you have the number of loops on your needle that the pattern tells you to. So needle in, yarn around, pull it through, all exactly like the knit stitch, and then that new loop that you just created, you stick it over onto the other side. And now I have 3 loops. So every time you do that, you add 1. If your pattern says cast on 10 stitches, you're doing that till you've got 10 loops. So that is the knitted cast on. There's a very slight variation to that, which I have seen called the cable cast on. I'm not sure if it has another name. This isn't one that I use, but it is one that I have seen mentioned. The only difference between, as far as I understand it, between the knitted cast on and the cable cast on is for the knitted cast on, that loop that you've got on your needle, when you put your needle through it to do the knitted cast on, you just go through one leg of that loop, just like you would for the knit stitch. If you're going to do the cabled cast on, you put your needle all the way through so that you're under both loops of that. You're kind of between one stitch and the other. And otherwise you just do the exact same thing. So for the cable cast on, you put your needle in, you wrap your yarn around, you pull it through, and it's between the two stitches, and then you slide it over. Like I said, there may be a different style of cable cast on than that, but I have seen that style called the cabled cast on. The pros of this cast on is it's very beginner friendly. It's very easy if you don't do a lot of projects, even if you're not a beginner. If you don't spend tons of hours doing knitting, you just dip in and out. I think this one is a lot easier to remember how to do because it's so similar to the knit stitch. It also gives you a nice firm edge, so you have this nice amount of fabric that you're working with under there. So it's going to look really neat and tidy when you're finished with your project. That edge that you created is going to look really neat and tidy. The cons for this one, as far as I'm concerned, are it takes longer. If you're casting on 20 stitches, it's not a big deal. If you're casting on 200 stitches, you'll notice that this takes a little bit longer to do. So that was the knitted cast on. My personal favorite, the one that I use when I'm just going to casually cast on a project, is what is called the long tail cast on. And the reason that I like this more than the knitted cast on is because it's faster. That is the one and only reason. To me, if I were to look at a finished project, like look at an edge, I personally would not be able to tell if it was a knitted cast on or a long tail cast on. To me, they look identical. They have the same structure. They have the same like nice, firm, neat and tidy look to them. But the long tail cast on is just faster. The one downside for the long tail cast on is you have to guess how long a tail you want for it. The more stitches you're casting on, the longer that tail needs to be. And it's kind of, you just guess. There are ways that you can measure and wrap it and do all of that. I don't bother. I just make it longer, for sure longer than I need it to be, and call it a day. So if I'm just going to cast on a couple of stitches, this is plenty long enough. This would probably do me 15 stitches without any trouble. You're going to tie a slip knot. That's how most cast-ons start. Tighten it up just a little bit. And the long tail cast on, you're only using one needle. You are going to take these two strings that are connected to it. You are going to put your finger and your thumb like a little bird beak. Can you tell I am at home with toddlers a lot? It's going to go through there, and then the bird beak is going to open up, and you're going to grab the strings on the bottom this way. So you have one string is on one finger, one string is on your thumb. And then, let's see if I can do this backward looking at the camera. I'm going to make it look like I've never done this cast on before in my life. I'm trying to do it so that you can see it at the same angle when you're looking at it, doing it yourself, you can do it. So you're going to take the pointy end of that needle, you're going to go down and you're going to pick up the loop that is on your thumb. You're going to come over to the middle of your pointer finger, touch the middle of your pointer finger, slide it all the way down your pointer finger to grab that loop that's on there, and then you're going to go back through the center, or back through that loop that was around your thumb. And now you've got your two loops on there. So I'm going to do it this way to be slightly less awkward, hopefully. You go down under your thumb, grab that, over to your pointer finger, grab that, back down through the loop that's around your thumb. And that puts another loop on it. And so now I've got those 3 loops. You may be watching me thinking, I thought she said this was faster. So when I am just casting on, this is how it looks. This is what it looks like when I'm doing it. So to me, that is a lot faster. But you'll notice every time I add a stitch, I use up part of that tail. Every stitch uses up a little smidgen of that tail. And so if your pattern said cast on 200 stitches, this tail is not going to do 200 stitches. This tail is going to do 10 stitches. So just leave yourself a long enough tail. That's the biggest downside, in my opinion, of the of the long tail cast on. I think, again, it gives you a nice structure. It's nice and neat and tidy. It's a firm edge that you're working your stitches against. And I think it's very easy to work from and to work with. So this is the one that, unless I'm doing something very specific, decorative or multicolored or something real casting on in the middle of a project kind of a thing, this is the one that I use. Long tail cast on. I never think about it. This is just my personal preference all the time. The other cast on that the main one that I'm going to show you right now is one that I hate. And I almost never tell anybody that they're doing anything wrong. It's, if you're having fun, you're doing it right. And I really I stand by that. In my opinion, if you're doing this cast on, you're doing it wrong. There's nothing good about this cast on, and it never ends well. And that is what's called the backward loop cast on. This is one that I think a lot of beginners start with because it seems like it would be incredibly easy. And it is incredibly easy to create the cast on. The problem is it is incredibly hard to work that first row into that. And if you're a beginner, that first row of knitting is already going to feel a little bit hard. You don't need to add to it. I also think it looks really sloppy within your finished project. But the backward loop cast on, you tie your slip knot, you don't need a long tail, you put it over there. Like I said, don't do this. This is not this is an example of what not to do. You take your yarn, you make a loop, you turn the loop backwards, and you stick it on your needle. And you can tighten it down a little bit. You take a loop, you put it on, you turn it backwards. You make a loop, you put it on, you turn it backwards. So it seems like a really easy way to cast on, right? And it kind of, I mean, the cast on part is really easy, but there's no fabric here. There's no structure. There's nothing that keeps these stitches from stretching all out and some getting pulled super tight, and then there being these big gaps in between it. It's really hard to work that first row onto it. And it's gonna look messy. That edge is not gonna look neat and tidy. It's gonna be all pulled and weird. So in my opinion, this is not a good cast on to use. I will say there are the odd times, the only time that I have ever done this cast on is when you're doing a very specific kind of project where you are trying to cast stitches on when you're in the middle of a row. So the only example that I can think of is when you've separated the sleeves on a sweater, you've taken the stitches off that are going to become the arm, and you're working on the body stitches, and you're going to cast on a couple of stitches in the armpit. So you still have stitches on your needle, your working yarn is still connected, and you just need to add a couple of little loops on there. Sometimes you can do the knitted cast on, but it kind of depends on where your yarn is and exactly how that whole thing works. And you have to turn it if you're going to do the knitted cast on and turn it back again. So casting on stitches in the middle of a row in very specific situations are the only time that I would ever recommend doing that backward loop cast on. And it is only because if you're knitting a sweater, you're probably not a brand new first day ever knitter, and when you're in the armpit, you're probably not gonna, it doesn't matter that you've got that messy edge situation going on. So those are the main three. When I think about what are the cast-ons that I think most people have heard of or do, or I see mentioned in patterns, those are the main three. There are lots and lots and lots of other ways to cast on. They kind of fall into, in my opinion, they kind of fall into two different categories. You have the ones that are done for a very sort of structurally essential reason. The only one that I can think of for that is what's called the provisional cast on. And the provisional cast on actually allows you to cast on, put stitches on your needle, but have the ability when you finished knitting whatever you're knitting for that, to then go back, take that cast on out that you did, put those stitches back on your needle and knit the other direction without creating a seam or without it being a big pain in the behind. The main time that I personally do this is when I'm making a sweater for myself from the bottom up. which I don't do very often, but I have done this with the Provisional Cast On. I do the Provisional Cast On. I make the whole sweater. I really like my sweaters long, and I really like using all of my yarn. So it's kind of a weird thing to do, but the reason that I personally do it is because I can knit the entirety of the sweater, I can try it on, I can do all of that stuff, and then if I have half a ball of yarn left over, I can make my sweater longer because I haven't finished that bottom one, that bottom portion. And so I can add an extra couple of inches to the length of the sweater if I want to. There are provisional cast-ons for other reasons. There's a sock toe technique called the Sherman, maybe it's a heel technique, the Sherman heel, Sherman toe. Some lace shawl patterns will have you do that in the middle. You'll do a provisional cast on, you'll knit half of it, and then you'll come back and put your needles back in and go the other half, because lace is directional. So if you want like your points of your chevrons or something going in the same direction to create that mirrored look, you would do it that way. So there are reasons to do a provisional cast on, but they're incredibly specific. That's not one, if you see it written in a pattern where it says, do a provisional cast on, you can't substitute just any cast on you want. That's one that is very structurally important. So if it says provisional cast on, you probably need to do a provisional cast on, or at least you need to really understand why they want you to do one, and you need to know what you are going to do differently so that you don't need one. The other example that I thought of while I was talking is the Mobius Cast On. If you've never heard of it or seen it, it's very, very weird. And you'll know it if you're doing it. It is to create a true Mobius. You can create sort of false Mobius by casting on in the round, and then normally a pattern that you're doing in the round will say join in the round, being careful not to twist. A faux Mobius cast on will say being careful to twist. And so instead of creating like a tube, you're going to create a tube that does a full twist around. So like you might do this in a cowl to have that full twist around. That's a faux Mobius cast on. A true Mobius cast on is wackadoo. You've got a super, super long needle. You twist the cord of your circular needle, you double it back on itself, and you're casting on your needle and on the cord of the circular needle. It's a very specific cast on, and it creates a very specific look. So the Mobius cast on would be another one that I would say, if the pattern says that, you need to do that. If you're choosing not to do that, you need to know what you're going to do instead. And I would say for Mobius, there's nothing else that you can do instead. If you don't want to do the Mobius cast on, pick a different project. There's not really a get out for that. So those are the type of cast on that you do specifically for the function, and you cannot really substitute those out for other things. The other category of cast-ons, in my opinion, is decorative cast-ons. So this is an example of that. This is a picot. You've got those little nubbles that go up and down on there. And so they are decorative for the most part. They are going to add some stretch. So you will see them not infrequently on the cuffs of socks. That's what this will be when it grows up. It will get toes and heels. But it does make a stretchier cast on. But most of the time, I mean, you can just do a stretchy cast on. Just don't pull it as tight as you're doing it, and it will be stretchier. This is just, it's a decorative design that you are doing. So with this, if you see a pattern that says using a picot cast on, for the most part, if you just don't like the way that looks, do whatever cast on you want. It'll be fine, because this is just decorative. Another example with this is there are various two-color cast-ons that you can do. So if you're starting a project and you're going to have a, it's a ribbing but in Fair Isle, and it's not called ribbing. It's escaping me right now. But basically, like, you purl in color 1 and then you knit in color 2. So you have, like, it looks like stripes, but they're vertical stripes. that are also the corrugated ribbing. You may do a 2-color cast on so that the stitches that are going to become the knit stitches are in one color and the stitches that are going to become the purl stitches are the other color in your cast on. So there are 2-color cast ons. And those, again, are decorative. You can just cast on with one color. The whole cast on will be one color, and then you introduce your second color to that. So that's a decorative decision to make. So to me, those are kind of the main things. I think pick one of the, either the knitted cast on or the long tail cast on are generally, people have one of those that's sort of their go-to. And if you see a pattern that is calling for a different kind of cast on that's not one of those, almost always, if you would rather do the one that you normally do, that's fine. Do the one that you normally do. It may be worth reading a little bit farther into the pattern to see, is this a cast on that, especially if it's one you've never heard of before, is this a cast on that's somehow going to be really important to the structure of this piece, or is it just the person who wrote the pattern preferred to do a cabled cast on, but I prefer to do a long tail cast on? Those are very interchangeable. That's just the personal preference of the person who's doing it. So the only two I can think of that you probably need to do what the pattern says is going to be a Mobius cast on and a provisional cast on. Everything else is probably, if you have one that you like better, do that one. It'll work out fine. So I hope this inspired you to cast on some new projects.